We're here on the AISH podcast. I'm Shalvie Friedman, a senior educator for AISH UK.
I'm Ilana Epstein, and I work for Jewish Futures and TAM.
TAM meaning?
TAM means taste, and it's an organization that engages people in their Judaism through food. And we'll discuss it more afterwards.
Okay, great. So if we're talking about engaging in Judaism and food, we're here today to talk about a very well-known Jewish phrase which involves food and Jewish identity, bageling.
So I have to say it wasn't really well known. When we started discussing what we would talk about, I actually had to look it up and ask my kids what it was. And there was no definitive answer.
Did your kids have like a sense of what it is?
So they definitely did. They had a sense, and I was trying to grasp it. They didn't have a clear definition, but it really was something I had to investigate to figure out what it was. So I was really surprised. You're like, sure, bageling happens to everyone.
But it's happened to you, right?
So I had to think back. So firstly, I got my definition, which I was going to share. It's the conscious act or speech of a non-obviously looking Jewish individual to an obviously looking Jew intended to indicate that he or she is also Jewish, or the conscious act of a non-Jew towards a Jew to indicate his or her affinity with the Jewish people.
Yeah, I mean, we were just on a train to Brighton, and there was this big tattooed African-American guy behind us who picks up his phone, and we hear him on his phone, me sitting there with my hair covering and my, Jewish looking children and very Jewish looking rabbinic husband. And the guy behind, he picks up his phone and he goes, yo, he says, Shabbat Shalom, Moti. And he just called his Jewish friend because he saw us and he wanted us to know he knows Jews. And they have this whole conversation. He goes, I want to come visit Israel. Should I come Chanukah time? I think that's in January, right? We're like, and not only do you know Jews, but you know Jewish things. Well done,
So I think that I had to think back. I had to consider, has it ever happened to me? And I couldn't think of an incident that ever happened to me alone. With my husband, it has happened because he wears kippah, head covering, out in public, but it's never actually happened to me. I get other nationalities, but I've never gotten straight out Jewish.
Oh, really?
And I feel like either it's because we lived in Israel for 17 years and
oh, that's true.
There's no need to bagel someone in Israel. And I grew up in New York at times. And again, maybe everyone was Jewish around me, so there was no need. But I guess here in London, it hasn't happened to me other than when I'm with my husband. And I was thinking about that a lot.
That's very interesting because I had that. I mean, I've been at a park. I was at a park in Watford and an Israeli couple asked me for directions to the bathroom. And I gave them directions. And as they were about to walk away, the father turns around and he goes, in Hebrew, he said, "Anachnu shomrim kashrut babayit." We keep kosher at home. And I was like, okay, I wasn't asking about your kosher levels. But he obviously felt this affinity to be like, I'm in your club, which I think is what's so interesting.
And I guess that's what I was thinking of. Is there a need for people to they want you to know, but why do they want me to know that they're Jewish? Or why do they want my husband, at the very least, to know they're Jewish? And maybe if I had some outward symbol of Judaism, they'd also want me to know. And I was thinking, why is there that need?
Right.
Where does it stem from, that need to be identified as a Jew?
I think that people like to feel like, and this is something that, we've spoken about before, people like to feel like they belong to a club. It's kind of like tribalism. They feel like they belong to a community, and it gives them a deep sense of meaning and purpose when they belong to the Jewish community. And if they see a Jew, they can be on a flight to Egypt or to Dubai, and they see a fellow Jew, they want to feel like a sense of affinity to that person to kind of emphasize that they belong to that same club.
So I'm wondering, is it if that is the case, let's say they want to feel that affinity, then why not just actively participate? Or are they already actively participating, but you spot a Jew and you're like, oh yeah, you and me, we're the same. We're from the same club.
What do you mean by actively participate?
I guess if this person who is on the train, who's indicating to you that either he knows Jews or wants to be with Jews or is a Jew, then why isn't he at whatever Jewish function it is? Or was this just oh, I spotted a Jew, I remembered that I like being Jewish?
I think people like belonging, even if they don't necessarily do much Jewish, meaning I may not, go to shul on Shabbos, or like you're saying, go to all the Jewish events. But at the same time, people feel like their Jewish identity is a deep part of existentially who they are.
Yeah.
And they feel that they can identify as Jewish and justifiably so, belong to the community without necessarily, dressing as Jewish looking as I am. I probably should not tell the story on air, but I was once in a deli somewhere in America, and it was just before Pesach, and there were like tons and tons. The place was packed out. So I turned to my husband and I said to him, wow, who knew there were so many Jews in this neighborhood? Because we'd been into that deli countless times and been empty year round. And suddenly, the day before Passover, it's packed out. And a woman standing next to me in line turned to look at me, and I was wearing a scarf and I was wearing a skirt, and she looked me up and down and she said, that's because we don't all dress the way that you do.
Oh my. Okay. Wow.
But maybe there is the sense, meaning that's the negative spin on it.
Yeah.
But the positive spin is people say, I don't have to, I believe this, you don't have to dress the way I do in order to belong to our club,
No, I totally agree. I think it's just, for me, it's curious because I guess being a generation older and not having felt the effects of Bageling, I'm used to spotting the Jew. Like, you're on a plane, you're going not to Israel, you're going somewhere else, and you're like, where's the Jew? And for me, it's like tribalism and being protected. It's not like an identity thing. It's like, okay, where's the other Jew? And
so that I feel safe.
It really comes from safety.
Do you think it's like a post-Holocaust, survivors,
sure.
children of survivors mentality?
I've got, 2 passports. I'm angling for a third one right now. Never have an out-of-date passport. It was like a big thing growing up.
Yes, absolutely. We always had 2 passports.
Yeah, and they have to be in date.
Yes.
Because God forbid something happens.
Now, what's interesting is if it's just a safety thing, which is like you find that fellow Jew as like your anchor, and not necessarily your identity. So that raises an interesting question, which is it maybe because we're Jewish that we feel unsafe, and yet we look to our fellow Jew to feel a sense of safety?
I think because we're Jewish, we do have that tendency to insecurity. And I don't know if that we're looking to them for safety. Rather, if someone else, like if someone's going to pick on me for being Jewish, I know there's someone else who will back me up, hopefully.
Right.
I remember this so clearly. My brother and I were flying together to London, and I was heavily pregnant and very ill after the flight. And my brother, who is a rabbi with a beard and a kippah and looked overtly Jewish, was really very far ahead of me in line. Those horrible, like, long lines. And at some point, the lines, like, you see each other across the line at passport control. And I was like, Bensi, can I come and, like, be with you? He's like, no. I was like, what do you mean, no? He's like, someone's going to think something badly because we're Jewish and you're cutting the line.
Wow.
And I was like, but I'm going to throw up. He's like, no, you keep it together because I don't want anyone to think poorly of us, that I, as a Jew, am making you come, like I'm enabling you to cut the line.
Right.
And I think it made me very aware for the first time in my life that, like, people are looking, and I think it may be harder for men than it is for women, men who are overtly wearing Jewish symbols out in the world. Right. And he was very conscious of this, and I just wasn't.
Right. I think that leads to an interesting, scenario in that we often have a sense of like brotherly Jewish shame, meaning, I don't know if you've ever been in a situation where a fellow Jew is acting in a way which is embarrassing.
Yes.
And maybe a Jew who looks more Jewish than you do, and you want to like jump up and be like, we're not related, or don't let them represent us. But we do. We somehow carry the burden of their misdeeds on our shoulders, which means that it's more than just a security. It is a sense of identity.
It is.
We look at our fellow Jews, and we identify with whatever it is that they're doing, whatever it is that they are in the world, and therefore how they behave, we feel like it reflects badly upon or good upon us, in that, so that there must be something. It's like a very existential identity issue which comes up.
Maybe that answers my first question, that I don't want to identify with a Jew who's doing something that I don't agree with out in the world. So like in the news, when you hear a Jew's done something, you're like, oh God, no, not again. So I'm going to hide my Jewish identity out in public. But if I see a Jew who's acting respectful, I'm going to let him know that I'm Jewish too. So it's like living on both worlds. So it's easy enough to attach yourself to that identity when you're comfortable, but easy enough to distance yourself when you're not comfortable with what's going on around you.
Right. Now, what's interesting is that what happens when we take that identity one step further? I know I don't live in a religious neighborhood, and I often meet young moms when I'm out with my kids who like to also bagel me in various forms. And I've got story after story, but often once I've been bageled, meaning once they've presented themselves as Jewish to me, I tend to invite them over for a Friday night or whatever it is. And more often than not, people don't follow through with it. And I'm curious if they just think I'm a strange, religious lady, or if they really simply see the fact that they bageled me as me saying, hey, I'm Jewish. I don't necessarily want to talk to you or build a relationship with you or do anything more with you, but just so you know, I'm in your club.
So we have that because we don't live in a religious neighborhood either. And we're the rabbi and his wife in a community that many of our members are not, I guess, practicing would be the word. And we'll call them up and we'll invite them for a meal. And they're like, well, we don't come to shul. We're like, yeah, we know, but that's fine. They're like, but why would we come to a meal if we don't come to shul? So we've paid our membership. We want you to know we're there, but we don't necessarily want to do beyond that. So maybe that's what's happening to you in the park. Like, I'm here.
I'm paying my dues.
I'm paying my dues. I said hello to the religious lady. I'm not embarrassed to do so, but that's enough. Like, I've done my bit for today.
Right. So I think that one of the things which is worth exploring is asking ourselves if bageling is a form of Jewish identity and if people don't necessarily want to further that identity beyond bageling. So what is it that makes people identify as Jewish?
It's a really good question. I think it's something that Jews probably have been asking themselves forever.
Right. Well, specifically, in the last 200 years with the Enlightenment, it's become an even more, a hot topic.
I think maybe even more modern. I think since the rise of the State of Israel, since anti-Semitism until very recently was something that was hidden and not spoken about, your ability to go out in the world and identify as a Jew was within your own control. And what are the things I'm going to do to identify as a Jew?
What do you mean by that?
So I think prior to World War II, anti-Semitism was rife, and World War II is obviously the climax of that. And then after World War II, there was a hiatus. There was kind of this, we don't do anti-Semitism. It's, it's vile, it's horrible, because the atrocities of World War II are now 75 years. In the past, we've seen a reemergence of anti-Semitism. But for that hiatus period of 60 or so years, Jews really could go out in the world and decide how they presented themselves. And what we see in modernism, I think, is that challenge to a Jew. How do I choose to present myself? How do I choose to be a Jew in this world? And I'm not talking about either of the extremes of being so completely out of the modern world because you've taken yourself out of it and you're ultra practicing, or to the other extreme where you're so part of the modern world that there's nothing left of you that's Jewish. I'm somewhere in the middle.
Right.
So that middle
somewhere
ground,
in the middle is a very big spectrum.
It's huge. And I think that that's what we're talking about. We're in that middle spectrum. Do you choose what you think will identify you as a Jew or make you feel connected?
Right. Well, one of the things is obviously food.
Yes, food is definitely, what I say about food is that it's the last thing someone will let go of on their way out of Jewish engagement. So you'll have a bagel on a Sunday morning.
Well, that's where the phrase comes from.
Exactly, I'm Jewish. Or on your way back into Jewish practice, it's being the woman that you've invited to a meal in the park. That's your first steps into Jewish practice. And I think it starts and
Friday
ends
night
with
dinner?
food. Friday night dinner, someone inviting you for tea or coffee and talking about Judaism. I really believe that it's the most easy pathway into Judaism. It's also the easiest pathway out of Judaism.
Right.
So in terms of identification, it's an easy one, but I think there's so many other things along that spectrum.
Right. Like what?
So we were discussing this previously in terms of repairing the world, this concept that in Hebrew we call tikkun olam. What is the Jews' responsibility to repair the world outside of their own Jewish community? And it's a topic that I've discussed with many young people. And I'm sure you've been in those discussions too. Like, how do they feel about it?
I think that it's interesting that you say that. I think that it's a core value for many people in terms of Jewish identity. Up there with going to synagogue on Yom Kippur perhaps, or and it's interesting because, my concern is as follows. Often when people, sometimes the pluralism of and the expression of this tikkun olam concept of doing kindness and really reaching out to all in the world, not that it's not a Jewish value, but it's not an intrinsically Jewish value, meaning it's not an exclusively Jewish value. And as a result of it not being an exclusively Jewish value, if this is something which is my primary expression of my Judaism, and yet it's an act which isn't exclusively Jewish, so then is that actually bringing you closer into the fold? Or is this just a form of religious observance, which could be any religion, really? You could be Christian, you could be Muslim, you could be anybody, and doing, kind things in the world and really caring for humanity. And as a result, something could be lost. Meaning, if we're not doing actions that are exclusively Jewish, then are we building Jewish identity in an authentic way?
So I guess my question to you is, because you said core values. I think all of Judaism's core values are universal. Like our real core values, those are universal. It's our expectation of every human. I think it's when we get to the particular that we become Jewish. But we're looking at universal qualities we want from a Jew.
I don't know, remembering the exodus from Egypt.
Okay, not universal.
It's not a universal
and I was
concept
thinking,
at all.
Believing in God,
Yes.
don't steal, don't murder. Those are core human values.
Right.
Into it, we add our belief in God, and that comes from remember the exodus from Egypt.
Right.
So, yeah, I suppose the way we've taken those core values is that we're always answerable to God. So can we put repairing the world on that same trajectory?
Right. I hear that. I guess I'm not saying core values. I guess we should speak about, core Jewish expressions or core Jewish actions.
Oh, I like that. Core Jewish expressions. So what would be a core Jewish expression?
A Seder night.
A Seder. Which, by the way, I think is like the most practiced Jewish ritual.
More than Hanukkah?
Yes.
Wow.
I think it's something like 81% of Jews keep a Seder night.
Wow, that's
which
amazing.
Is huge. And I guess because it's really unique within Jewish practice, because it's conversation. You're being encouraged to speak.
Right.
And everything in the Seder is directed towards that conversation. So, okay, let's put that in our core Jewish values.
Core Jewish expressions.
Expressions, not values.
Right.
So
Friday night dinner is a core Jewish expression. It's a core Jewish action, which we do, which is, distinctly Jewish.
All right. So we're building up repertoire here.
I feel like I have students who, when they go out for coffee with their non-Jewish friends and they ask for the change, and their friends turn to them and say to them, "Oh, that's so Jewish of you."
Oh, that's horrible.
That's awful, right?
Yeah.
But somehow we have certain, if you imagine the stereotype of the Jew in the movie.
Yeah.
Who's the Jew? The Jew's the guy who's a schnorrer, who's counting coins and trying to, that somehow has become the core Jewish expression. A person who's, trying to get money and trying to, sneakily. But there must be a way to build a positive Jewish ethic, a positive Jewish identity through positive Jewish expressions that doesn't involve spreading outwards, but rather involves people turning inwards, back to their communities, back to their core Jewish expressions.
So I wonder if, there's a core Jewish expression of giving charity. It's a huge one by us. So is it that idea of charity begins at home? Like, and once you've done charity at home, you could look out into the world. So all these people who want to do this, you know, I've been to Ghana several times now with Jewish groups. And one of the things we emphasize with them is we have people in the community who are looking out after the community. You're representing a small portion of the community that's saying that as Jews, part of our responsibility is to the world. Yeah. And they take that on board really strongly. Does it make them engage in other Jewish things? I don't know if it's more or less than they did prior to coming on one of these programs. Do they feel Jewish while they're doing it? Only because they're on a Jewish program, but they would have gone on a non-Jewish program perhaps and done the same thing.
So I think that that's the point that I'm trying to make.
So I guess what I've done though, even though it's, yes, you need to feel Jewish, is that I give them direction. So yes, go out into the world, do good things, but don't forget that it begins and ends with God and with you being a Jew. So take that wonderful idea of giving and giving of yourself, which is really hard to go to an African country, not as hard as for the people in the African country, but there is some type of giving of yourself. But remember that you start and end with being a Jew.
Right. You know, it would be personally, I believe, and feel free to disagree, but I think it would be a pity if a person feels like the most powerful Jewish thing that they ever did was wearing a Jewish star while they were in Ghana helping, you know, the poor African children, you know, in Ghana, because surely there must be something more intrinsically Jewish in that action and in every action than just the star that you're wearing on your neck.
What if they came into it saying, because I'm a Jew, because I have been taught from a very young age that charity is really, really important, and looking after people who are less fortunate than me is important, and I've gone in there proudly wearing my Jewish star, and I want these people to know that I'm here as a Jew, and I'm very proud of that, and I'm going to pass down that value to my children of being a Jew who gives, and gives a lot.
Right.
I don't know that I see that. Like,
but as long as it results in that, meaning on the flip side, and you know, we know a lot of people who perhaps go to Jewish schools their entire life and have literally lived in the fold always, and then they go to university or they go to the workplace and they make friends with non-Jews, perhaps for the first time in their life, and suddenly they find themselves faced with all these well-meaning questions about Judaism. You have that friend who's like, oh, so why do Jews do X, Y, or Z? And the person turns around and they say, I actually have no idea. And that's often an opportunity for them. And we have this often at our Friday night table. We have a lot of young professionals at the table, and people will say, I have a question which I've never thought about, because being part of the community, I've never, thought of it as a question. But my non-Jewish, work partners are asking me why I do this, or what's the Jewish reason behind that. And that's an opportunity. For me, it's powerful when they turn back in. And they say, okay, so if this is the question, and that's a good question, I'm going to go back to my community, go back to my Friday night table, discuss it with my, Jewish colleagues, my Jewish friends, and then come back with something that's powerful and meaningful. For me, that's an incredibly powerful Jewish experience, to take what's in the core of Judaism and to use that as a way to reach out to educate both yourself and those around you. For me, that feels like a very authentic Jewish experience.
So I don't disagree. I think that's great. I think people should be doing that. And I think it's wonderful that you're being presented with questions, and that there are questions, and there's a comfortable and secure place to ask questions and investigate them and come back with answers. But I don't know that somehow excludes going out and doing good in the world as a Jew, and that being part of your Jewish expression.
I agreed, as long as it is part of your Jewish expression. Meaning, for me, it should be part of a journey within Judaism, as opposed to a standalone event, which is the only part of Judaism.
But I guess we won't know until they go on the journey. That's true. Let's let them go on the journey, and then give them, because maybe they wouldn't have gone on the journey at all. Maybe, if you haven't opened the door to say, you like doing good in the world, and here's a way to do it Jewish style. If we hadn't opened that door, maybe they wouldn't have turned up at your table.
Right.
to then say, well, now I know that I did something which I feel really positive about, which is Jewish. And now I want to know more other things that I'll feel really great about, which are Jewish, and some things which maybe I want to question. But if we don't open the door, then that conversation won't happen at all.
Right. I hear that.
So I think that that's, to me, like the idea of repairing the world. It's a big idea, and often it's relegated to different parts of Judaism than the Orthodox sector. And I want to say that it's always been part of the Jewish Orthodox sector. It's always been there, but perhaps not overtly so.
Right, and perhaps underutilized.
Yes.
Right.
So to me, that's a big one. But I guess I want to ask you, because you grew up in South Africa, what it was like. Did you feel Jewish or did you feel white?
It's funny because the Jewish community in South Africa is very, very insular, in that you could literally never speak to a person who's not Jewish until you hit university level, like literally never. So in that sense, I definitely felt more Jewish than I did white. Also culturally, often, it's not just as simple as black and white in South Africa. There's, Afrikaans people, and there's the white people, and there's the black people, and there's the colored people. It's so multi, racial. It's so multiracial that it's not just a question of whether I'm black or white, and Jews fit into one of those little pockets of within the spectrum of different races. So I definitely felt incredibly Jewish, and yet going to Israel after school and coming across suddenly all these Jews from all over the world actually made me feel more Jewish. Because I suddenly realized that my Judaism wasn't just about my small neighborhood and my small community in, Johannesburg, South Africa, but it was something so much bigger. And there were little pockets of us, little Jews everywhere, all over the world, and that we actually had a lot in common in terms of our language. And not English being the language, but the Jewish culture, the culture of Judaism, going to my first Pesach Seder that wasn't at my parents' house, and sitting and being like, oh, wow, we do that at home too. It's incredibly enlightening, and it leaves you with a lot of warm, fuzzy feelings,
That's
when
good.
you realize that you as a Jew means that you're linked up to so many people who you otherwise have almost zero in common with. And yet, because you're a Jew and they're a Jew, you almost belong together in a very strange kind of way.
I think it brings us back to Bageling.
What do you mean?
Because you're identifying with another Jew. I've got nothing in common with you. I happen to be on a train to the same destination, and I need you to know that I'm part of this club.
Right.
That if we speak for long enough, we'll find that we have something in common.
Right.
A shared experience, a shared value.
Do you think there's also an element of trust? Meaning that if I see a fellow Jew, because I feel like we have the same common ground, or the same, whatever it is, the same fibers within our body, so I feel like I can trust you. Like, remember you said at the beginning, you spoke about security. Maybe it's not so much security and safety, but it is a deep sense of trust. I remember we were once on the way to Italy, and my husband's wallet got stolen on the flight. We got off the plane. It was 1 a.m. We had 2 exhausted children, and we were literally, you get those like hack emails out, like I'm homeless and I have nothing.
Oh God,
we were those
horrible.
people. And we went to rent the car, and they wouldn't let us rent the car because we couldn't pay with the credit card for the deposit. We had prepaid for the car, but we couldn't give the deposit, and his credit card was stolen, and my credit card could only work in Israel. And he looked around, and I looked at him and I said, what are we going to do? And he looked around, and he walked up to a random Jewish guy who had been on our flight from Israel. And he walked up to him and he said, this is going to be the weirdest thing you've ever heard in your life. He said to me, but can I borrow your credit card for a £4,000 deposit?
Oh my God.
But we won't use it. And when we get back, we'll change the deposit for our credit card.
Yeah.
And the guy blinked once, and he said, sure, no problem. And it was one of the most Jewish things that have ever happened to me, but it was crazy. I still think about it. I don't know if I would ever do that to anybody. But there's a sense of trust of I can ask for some small change, or I can ask for a favor.
£4,000
or they'll look out
is
for
not
me.
small change.
4,000, yes, correct.
Is it trust, or is it like that family thing? I'll ask my family member. So with the exclusion of your family not being there, then the closest Jew becomes your closest family member.
Right.
So is it a shared history and a shared destiny that connects you?
Well, you're from New York, correct?
So I grew up in South America, but I was born in New York, but I grew up in Caracas and then in Rio de Janeiro, then Hong Kong, and then finally London.
Many identities.
Yes. So I think the difference was in South America, which both Venezuela and Brazil are very Catholic countries. The word Jew wasn't often used by the non-Jews. We were called Hebrews. Wow. Which I always thought was interesting. And, you know, the people who we would meet, there were different society in South America, at least in the 70s and 80s, was very stratified. So like different people had different statuses in society, and the people who were looking after the house and looking after the garden would ask us, like, where are your horns? So it's a type of like throwback because there were so few Jews, they couldn't identify them. But in truth, there are a lot of Jews. They just don't know how to identify them. Right. We met people who trace back their Jewish lineage to the first conquistadors that came from Spain with Jews who were hiding their Judaism. And people who would tell us like, oh, I light candles Friday night in a cupboard behind closed doors. And we're like, the Spanish Inquisition's over. You could do it openly now. Like, no, but that's our tradition that we need to light it behind a closed door, and not really knowing where those traditions came from. So I think Judaism in South America is a very different kettle of fish than it is. Obviously, we were part of the modern Jewish community, people who came to those countries either just before or just after World War II. So there, again, it was a Jewish enclave like you had in South Africa. You only spoke to Jews. You had nothing to do outside the Jewish community. You went to a Jewish school and then you went to a Jewish club. But our identity as Jews within a Jewish framework was very strong, but outside of it, we had to be very circumspect about presenting as Jews.
Oh, really? Okay.
And I don't know, more xenophobia than anti-Semitism.
Okay.
So I think that was it. But I guess what always kept me as a child very grounded is that we didn't move countries, we moved communities. We moved from a community in one place to a community in another place.
So you always belonged to the Jewish community.
We always belonged to the Jewish community, and it set the framework for wherever we were. Right. Like we'd fall right back into the same pattern of life, the same level of involvement.
Which leads us back to this idea of identity.
Yeah.
That's really, I often wonder if as a South African, if I'm in a situation where I need to turn to a stranger, and on my right-hand side I'd have a South African, on the left-hand side I'd have a Jew, I'd always turn to the Jew, not the South African, meaning I identify so much more as a Jew than I do as a South African.
So I think this is a question, definitely in American schools, that was often debated. Are you a Jewish American or are you an American Jew?
Right. And what's the practical difference?
So I guess a Jewish American is, one of them you identify more strongly with being Jewish, and the other one you identify more strongly as being American. I'm not sure which one is which.
A Jewish American is primarily an American.
Yes,
and an American Jew is
primarily a Jew. And it was a question, how do you identify more strongly with being American or with being Jewish? Mm-hmm. And it's a question that I think has really followed Jews for the last 2,000 years. And in Israel, the same question's being asked right now. Are you Israeli or are you Jewish?
Right. And I mean, that's the heat of Israeli politics right now in terms of inclusion and all sorts of other important questions that they're asking.
So I think we see it a lot. I mean, you and I definitely see it with Israelis living in the diaspora.
Yes.
So Israelis living in London, Israelis living in New York, they identify primarily as Israelis, not as Jews.
Yeah.
And that it's really very confusing.
Especially because to identify as an Israeli and live in the diaspora is quite challenging, because what makes you Israeli is often, cultural realities which are not happening when you're living in the diaspora. Yeah. So outside of the language, there's very little that makes an Israeli.
So I think it
unless there's
becomes
Jewish.
something, I guess, America's a land of immigrants. So you have Italian Americans and Armenian Americans and Russian Americans, and their culture morphs. It becomes an Italian American culture that when translated back to Italy has very little in common. It's like it develops there differently. And I guess for Israelis who are like 1 or 2 generations apart, like removed from Israel, is their identity going to change?
Right, because if you think about those American, Italian Americans, whatever it is, 3 generations down the line, you're left with pure American.
We have
often the
Irish
grandchildren
Americans,
of, right.
which there's very little that's Irish about them anymore.
Right, exactly. Meaning once you go 3 generations down, you're left very little with the original identity. So if we're talking about Jewish identity as a secondary identity, the danger, and we see this in terms of the assimilation rates across the globe, but specifically in America, we see that, 3 generations down the line, there's very little left of Jewish identity, and it's primarily an American identity.
So I think maybe you've proven your point better than I did, because if we go back to Tikkun Olam idea, that repairing the world, is it enough? Is it enough to identify as Jewish, doing Tikkun Olam, doing this repairing the world, or do you need to do more? Do you need to, the journey's only a positive one if you continue further, if you go beyond repairing the world, because you need to identify as a Jew.
Yeah. But I think we can move it beyond just, Tikkun Olam. We could talk about externalities versus internalities. Meaning, if my Jewish identity is only something I do on the outside, whether it's in my dress or in the food that I eat, then I'm at risk again of my children seeing just a shell of an identity as opposed to a real intrinsic identity. And that's something which also is at risk of being watered down or lost as the generations go.
I think so, but I know historically, at least, when you had all these immigrants coming to America, so you have 2.5 million immigrants that leave Eastern Europe between 1880 and 1914, with a majority of them, nearly 2 million, going to America. If we do the maths, there should be 20 million in America right now. There isn't.
Right.
And you have all these like written testimonies of people coming to America and literally shedding their Jewish clothing.
Yeah, they threw their tefillin out on the ships, didn't they?
And they're like taking off their wigs and they're dressing modern. And with every item of clothing they shed part of their Jewish identity. So that externality was really important, especially in a time before the learning that we do today, this in-depth learning that wasn't part of the experience of majority of Jews. And as they shed the clothing, they shed tradition, they shed identity, and they become American as soon as they step off the ship or very soon afterwards.
Right.
So I think the externality, as long as it's paired with an internal dialogue, is really important.
Right. But could you say that today we've it's possible, let's say not we have, but would you say today it's kind of possible to replace the external identity with the intense learning, which is what you mentioned?
Oh, wow. That's a really good question. So there are learning centers right now in Tel Aviv, which are meant for non-Orthodox, non-observant students.
Yeah, I mean, they exist in New York too.
So it's all about the learning without that externality, without the practice.
Yeah.
So I think that maybe that's part of the message of Judaism. It's part of the Jewish value is that they go hand in hand. You can't separate the external from the internal. There's no room for that separation.
Right. And yet, if you had to pick one without the other, can I ask that question?
Yeah, I have to think about it. Wow. It would probably be the internal because I'm looking after my soul.
Yeah, absolutely.
How about you?
I think that that's often the thing that people forget because Bageling is so external, meaning I don't look at a person and say, wow, you do Jewish learning. Hi, I'm Jewish.
Yeah.
I see what you wear. I see that you're, at the checkout counter with a box of matzahs, whatever it is. So I throw in a Jewish comment. But again, that's really judging a book by its cover, in that it's judging based on the externalities. And for me, I think part of the authentic journey towards, authentic and vibrant Judaism is when people recognize that the thing that makes them Jewish is less the matzahs and more what the matzah means. It's less the external and much more what's actually internally.
For sure.
And I think in that sense, and this maybe takes us full circle, that goes back to, that woman in the park who says something because I'm this very religious looking woman. And then I think often when I invite them over for a meal, they assume that my expectation of them is at some level they think that what I consider to be an authentic Jew is a person who dresses like me. And I wish I could say, and often I wish I could stop and be like, come for Shabbos, but I want you to know that you're as authentically Jewish as I am. And I don't need you to, and I'm not making any judgments on you, and I don't need you to change in any way. I'm glad that you identify as a Jew strongly enough to pick me out and bagel me in the park.
Yeah.
And as a result, I'd love to share that Jewish experience and your Jewish experiences with you and mine with me, and together create new Jewish experiences together. In a genuine way that's focused on the internalities and less focused on the externalities.
Absolutely. I think if we go back to those people that we met in South America who were 500 years later still lighting candles on Shabbat, they were focusing on the internal.
Yeah.
That was connecting them. If we were just doing the external, would have been left over.
Right.
Would there have been any sign of it?
Right. Yeah. Okay.
So I think I love this world, I have to say. I love existing in it. I love being a Jew in this modern age. I don't know. I think about it often. Would I have been able to survive if I was my grandparents' age, or any time that I learn history? Would I have been able to face up to that challenge?
Yeah.
If I was born in a different time and place. But I'm really glad that I was born in this time and place, because I have this great passion and responsibility to be Jewish. And it is responsibility to be a Jew in the world.
And to embrace others, and to embrace other Jews, to embrace other Jews and to embrace everybody else, and really finding a balance between those two.
And I'd really like to experience being bageled at this point. I'm a little jealous, I have to say.
Come to West Hampstead.
I'll be bageled. I can't wait. It has to happen.
So we've been on this whole journey today. We talk about bageling. We spoke about why people bagel people, whether it's Jewish identity or connection or safety or trust. And then we spoke about what the ramifications are for that bageling, in terms of what the core Jewish values or core Jewish experiences are, what they should be. Any closing?
I feel like it's a conversation that will never end. What is Jewish identity? I think that this is what we grapple with every single day. And I'm so glad.
We hope it will never end, because that's what gives us vibrancy.
Exactly. And I just think it's something we could keep on talking about forever. To be a Jew, what does it mean to be a Jew? It's such a huge topic.
Right.
But there's no end to it, nor is there any beginning to it.
Right. And it's something we have to keep arguing
Absolutely.
and keep discussing every generation and every year afresh.
Yes. 3 weeks from now.
Say the night. Yeah,
exactly.
Absolutely. That's what it's about, isn't it?
It's all about Jewish identity.
Yeah.
That's where we're going. Yay!
Without the bagels, with the matzah.
Without the bagels, all about matzah.
Yeah.
Can't wait.